Hello everyone, my producer's here, there we go. Hello everyone, welcome to the Raise.dev Hacktoberfest Help Desk. My name is Joe, I'm the community manager here at Raise.dev. This is our second show of the day, 2 out of 3, and I am super excited about this one. I've joked on the show a couple of times that this show is secretly just my agenda to get to hang out with cool people I haven't spoken to in a while. That is definitely happening on this show today. So we're going to be joined by a very special guest super shortly. I will add them on and we will get chatting. But before that, I want to run you through what we're doing here, what this show is all about. The Hacktoberfest Help Desk is a resource for you this Hacktoberfest to get the help you need with your Hacktoberfest contributions, whether you have big high-level questions such as what is open source and why do I, or very specific questions such as a particular issue you need help with. You can submit that issue to our form and we'll jump in there in the code with you to help you out. If you want to submit any questions to the Hacktoberfest Help Desk, you can find out where to do that at raise.dev Hacktoberfest. There's also a video highlight on our Twitch videos page that walks you through that submission process. As well as those questions, we're kind of doing like wide-ranging walkabouts and different topics. We had some people on earlier in the week to talk about documentation contributions, and we've got some very exciting shows coming up for the rest of the week on different areas of open source as well, which I'll run through towards the end of the show. So last thing for me before we get into this episode's show content, why are Raise.dev doing this? We are a brand new thing we launched over a week ago now. It's going very quickly to help you level up in your developer career, whether it's your first job you're looking to get or you're trying to get into the next position or next promotion. We are here to help you get the experience you need with hands-on coaching with expert devs. Right now, whilst we're in early access, it's free to meet up with one of our coaches, have a kickoff call. They'll set some professional goals with you and help you get to where you want to be. So we're doing this part of Hacktoberfest to help you get to where you want to be with open source this October, but we hope you'll join us to do that for your wider career. So that is all of my rambling. Let me introduce our guest for today. We are joined by Penelope Phippen. Welcome, Penelope.
Hi, Joe. How's it going?
It's going wonderful. I'm on my third cup of coffee of the day. We are psyched. It's rainy in Amsterdam. It's going good. How are you?
I'm doing okay, thank you. In the current times we live in, I'm actually also on my third coffee of the day, except it's only 10 a.m. here in New York. This speaks more to like how I consume coffee than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing that energy to the help desk today. So a couple of reminders for folks in chat actually before we get on. I forgot to do this, very sorry. If you want to share a URL with us or with chat whilst we're talking, say you've got a link that's relevant to the conversation or you want to share something about something we're talking about, please go ahead and do that, but give me a warning at RaiseDevs in the Twitch chat so I can add you to the allow list before that so that you don't get yourself banned. If Matt's here, try not to get yourself banned this time. Matt, the community manager of DigitalOcean, is on a solid once a stream ban streak, so we'll see what we can do about that. So, Penelope, do you want to introduce yourself and what you're currently up to the folks on the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Penelope Phippen. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently a software engineer at Stripe based in New York. Previously, I worked at Google as a developer advocate, and then previously to that, I was an engineering manager at DigitalOcean. Beyond work stuff, I have been a fairly prolific open source maintainer for a number of years now. I maintained the RSpec testing framework for about 7 years. I was the lead maintainer of RSpec for about 2 or 3. And now I'm working on a new project called rubyfmt, which is a Ruby auto formatter written mostly in Rust, but with some Ruby mixed in there because you have to. So yeah, that's me.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's pretty comprehensive. So, where to start? Let's start with RSpec actually. So for the folks in the crowd who aren't in the Ruby ecosystem, do you want to tell us a little bit about what RSpec is? I'm trying not to lead into this with do you want to tell us how instrumental RSpec is in the Ruby ecosystem? But that's kind of where this is going to go.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So RSpec is a testing framework written in Ruby that way back in the day sort of originated the idea of what is now called behavior-driven development style testing. RSpec is the most downloaded Ruby gem by, if you combine all the downloads of all the different RSpec gems together, almost an order of magnitude. RSpec is widely considered like one of the most influential pieces of open source software there is.
Right.
Like almost every other language has an RSpec style testing framework now that was influenced by the RSpec implementation. And so it really like it's funny. I came to RSpec like many years after like a lot of that initial work had been done, and sort of
Right.
like kept it going through more modern Rubies, right? So like, I mean, I personally ensured RSpec kept working with Rails 5. Like that is sort of
Nice.
like one of my biggest contributions to open source is I made RSpec work with Rails 5.
Congrats.
And so like, yeah, it's like it's hard to describe, except that like nearly every Ruby company I'm aware of uses RSpec for its
Yeah.
entire test suite, right?
Right.
Stripe actually doesn't, which is hilarious to me. But
What does Stripe use? Is it an internal thing or just like some other?
yeah, Stripe. It's sort of like an internal fork of Minitest,
Got you.
basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Interesting. Wonderful. Cool. So when we were kind of like talking before the show, I mentioned selfishly that I wanted to hear kind of like the story of how, like, I guess your open source story and how all this happened, because it occurred to me that I'd never heard this before. So how did you come to be on the RSpec team? What happened before that?
Yeah. So it's it's an interesting story.
Sure.
Basically, when I was in university doing my computer science degree,
Right.
one of the courses we could take was a web technologies course, which, like, such that it was, like, I guess, I don't know how this is now, right? It's funny. I've been out of university for about 8 years at this point, so I like, which sounds crazy to me, but
That's so many like Silicon Valley boom and bust cycles.
yeah. But like such that it is, right? This web technologies course, they were like teaching us, and then we had to like build a little web application, and they were like,
Right.
you can use Apache, Tomcat, and Java, or because that's it's a British University computer science course, so of course the Java technology, or like there's Python, there's Ruby on, like the lecturer was like, there's a bunch of these alternatives, I have no idea how they work, but if you want to,
but good luck.
Yeah, and like
Nice.
I had been like I had also been learning how to use Git and GitHub at the time because GitHub was relatively new,
Right.
and I had heard that GitHub was written in this Ruby and Rails thing, so I was like, okay, cool, let's give that a try, right?
Right.
And started working on a Rails app, and then like part of this course was like, now you have to write automated tests, and I was like, oh, cool.
I mean, that's pretty forward thinking for a university course, especially 8 years ago.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, cool. Like, let's find out how to do this, right?
Yeah.
And like it turns out at the time the Ruby on Rails community was just pumping out conference talk videos like no one else, and everyone was talking about this RSpec thing.
Yeah.
So I started using it, and I found a bug. I was like, oh, like I found some like edge casey issue.
Yeah.
And so I fixed it. And while doing that, I sort of found that the internals of RSpec were a huge mess. Like, just the code was like poorly factored. Like, Code Climate was very popular at the time, and
I remember Code Climate.
like basically, I was like, okay, I'm just going to take it on myself to like move each of these Code Climate scores like up a letter grade. Right. And I sent them so many pull requests and pinged them for so many reviews. They were just basically like, here, have a commit bit so that like you stop annoying us. I mean, that's not quite the story, but like that's how I like to imagine it, right?
Yeah.
And so really, like if I can summarize, right, it was basically just like showing up. I was like, I probably sent in the space of about 3 months, I probably sent them 2 dozen pull requests, right? And
wow. Okay.
yeah, they were just like, cool, you're a core team member now.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then like that's how I got started. And it's funny, like once you get a commit bit, weirdly, I found that like I was doing a lot less writing code and a lot more like reviewing pull requests and triaging issues and stuff, which is like a very different skill set.
Became a maintainer very rapidly overnight, basically.
Yeah, and actually, like once I got to like the end of my time at working on RSpec, nearly 100% of the work I was doing was actually just like moving issues to a point where they could actually be worked on.
Right.
The vast majority of the inbound issues did not contain enough detail to be able to rapidly start working on them, right?
Yeah.
Or even if they did, like I would then have to like, if it was a regression, have to like start bisecting RSpec revisions, or actually even worse, bisecting RSpec crossed with Rails revisions, like watching RSpec versions and Rails versions move, and like it turns out Git is not actually very well built to bisect multiple repos at once. And so like I built sort of like custom intuition for that, and good times.
That's wild. Okay, so I don't want to spend too long on RSpec, because I know that you're no longer maintainer on that project, so I've got a lot of questions there, but I'll resist those. So I guess you mentioned briefly there you were no longer maintainer on RSpec, and my understanding of that is you stepped back when you started working on Ruby format, because that was taking up the most of your time for open source now, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, like, there were, like, I think it was, like, the intersection of a number of things.
Sure.
One of it was that, like Ruby format is definitely like the largest part of this, and like because Ruby format is like it's very different in nature to the work on RSpec because it doesn't really have users today, and so like I'm sort of free to just kind of rip down whatever line of development makes most sense for me. But also like with RSpec, like I had kind of come to like a really natural stopping point. So when I offboarded, I basically did all of the work needed to get RSpec ready for the Rails 6 release, which, gosh, feels like a long time ago now because...
it's so funny, like you mentioned these major versions. My only insight into these versions as someone who doesn't do Ruby is just like the internal panic at GitHub during my time there where people were like preparing for these releases, just watching Eileen and going wild on it. So
I mean, I mean, it's funny, right? Because like Eileen and I are very good friends, right? So we talk about this a lot. And but no, the Rails 6 release was coming up, and I was basically like, here's everything we need to do. We're gonna release a major version. Like when that happens, I'm out. And then Rails 6 was kind of delayed versus when it was expected to be. So traditionally. Rails releases have occurred at RailsConf, and then RailsConf came and went, and there was no Rails 6, and I was just like, you know what? I got this other thing I'm working on. It's pretty rad. It's funny actually because like sort of pseudo appropriately, the first lines of code of Ruby format were written at a RubyConf. And like the last lines of RSpec I ever wrote were written at a RailsConf. So there's and those two conferences have a 6-month cycle. I should also disclose here, I guess, I'm a director at Ruby Central, the 501c3,
which I also want to talk about at some point.
Those two conferences on, and we run rubygems.org as well. And so there's this very nice symmetry in my head about these things being separated out.
Right. Yeah. So when was that? Because I remember you announcing it, but time is so wibbly wobbly nowadays that I literally cannot piece together in my head when you stepped back from RSpec. 2018?
I don't even know.
It's a while ago. But anyway,
let me look up on my own blog.
Find the tweet.
Oh, my website's down. Cool.
Yeah, I noticed that yesterday. I didn't know if that was intentional or not. I didn't want to be like, hey, your website.
I have no idea why. I should work that out at some point. Cool. Awesome. Do I have the Markdown repo on my computer? Technical difficulties.
It's all
good. 2019 10/07. So a year ago, exactly a year ago.
Wow.
Today. Exactly a year ago today is when I retired from RSpec.
That's wild. Well, happy anniversary. That's wonderful. So we've spoken about Ruby format now and about like I guess like the transitioning maintenance responsibilities over to it. What is Ruby format? What are we talking about?
So Ruby format is a Ruby auto formatter, which sounds like an unbelievably simple thing to say. So let's get into it a little bit. When I worked at DigitalOcean, I was tech lead and engineering manager for a team called BizOps Internal Tools, which we shortened that to Bits.
Very good.
And basically the purpose of Bits was to maintain DigitalOcean's internal administration monolith called Atlantis, and a sort of constellation of Go microservices that supported Atlantis. And so I was programming a lot of Ruby and a lot of Go. And if you work in Go at all, you'll sort of know that the folks in the Go community really care about their tooling. They have auto formatting, auto import management, linting. There's a ton of really, really great language tooling. And if you sort of listen to the designers of the Go language, they will talk a lot about how it was intentionally designed around being tooling friendly. And I think this is a really great outcome, right? You're working on Go, you save a file, the code just snaps into place. It gets auto-formatted in this single consistent formatting. And when you talk to Go developers, Elixir developers, even JavaScript developers to some degree with the Prettier and other formatters they have, they talk about this as being very table stakes. They almost won't approach a programming language if this kind of tooling doesn't exist.
Right.
And in Ruby, we have a tool called Rubocop. Yeah. And by the way, I really appreciate that you're dropping links to all the things I'm mentioning as we're speaking.
What I'm here for. I'm a walking transcription engine.
Rubocop. So Rubocop. And Rubocop is a tool which doesn't quite achieve this outcome. Rubocop was from the ground up designed to be a linter, and Rubocop does not work with Ruby's built-in parser, the tool that turns the source code into a data structure representation, right? And so you get a couple of outcomes from this. One is that Rubocop's autocorrection tooling can't actually apply to all of the rules Rubocop can identify, and it can get itself stuck in loops. Because of sort of weird reasons about how Rubocop's linting passes execute over pieces of code, it can actually get stuck in a case where one pass will output code that another pass disagrees with, and then that pass will output code that first pass will disagree with, and you get stuck in an infinite loop. Rubocop will actually repeatedly apply the rules until they settle, and will actually detect if it's in an infinite loop and crash.
Interesting. So I was going to ask, and this is kind of sad point, but how common that is. Is the rules that get it into that state something that the average Ruby programmer is going to run into in their code base, or is that a relatively edgy case?
No. I mean, I encounter it on a daily basis when I'm writing.
Wow. Okay.
My normal Ruby code.
Yeah.
And the code that I write is very sort of vanilla Ruby. I don't write that weird.
As we might expect of someone who is writing a Ruby formatter.
Yeah. And so that's sort of one dimension of problem with Rubocop. The other dimension of problem with Rubocop is it has these thousands of I actually don't know if the number is thousands. It's certainly hundreds of configuration rules, and you can basically turn. It's not even on and off in some cases. It's a choice between, do I want arrays aligned this way or that way or the other way, or how do I... And what we actually see practically is Rubocop's defaults are liked by no one, and so every single team does their own sort of unique spicy Rubocop configuration, and so
spicy Rubocop.
I mean, the reason I use the word spicy there, I guess, is that like these debates between individual teams can end up being like very fraught, actually. Like teams deciding how to lay out code can be very fraught.
Right.
And so like I find Rubicop just generally as a tool very unsatisfying. And so I had actually sort of originally ideated Ruby format like back in 2013, 2012. With a view to basically using Ripper, which is Ruby's built-in parser, to like walk an official, if you like, Ruby syntax tree and spit source code out the other side, and like try to do it so fast that it can live in your text editor, right? So like one issue with Rubicop is it can take like 600, 700 milliseconds to execute. That's far too slow for you to like save a file, wait basically a full second, and then resume edit. Nobody wants that workflow, right?
Yeah.
So what Ruby format is it's a program that consumes Ruby source code and spits out Ruby source code just in like a single, consistent, well-designed format, right?
Right.
And to do so very quickly. And yeah, like that was a long wind-up. But
no, that's perfect. And you've gone through. I've had to be taking notes as I go for things to visit back on. So I think the last one you mentioned that I think is important to visit back on, and was something I'd warned Penelope that I'd recently watched one of her talks on this topic. But you mentioned like the 600 milliseconds and how important that was. So something from a past talk of yours, which I really appreciated and thought was like super important on this topic. Were you talking about where a tool interacts with? I think you called it the interactivity loop. So like where you're like interactively building software and expecting the error to come back and this kind of thing. And the acceptable lengths of like milliseconds waits in that loop. So I guess from some perspective, like you said, like 600 milliseconds, like it's a long time. But like, where do we get to? Like, what kind of milliseconds do we start to see problems?
Yeah. So most people will not notice anything that takes about 100 milliseconds. And in fact, like Google actually has very good research into this, where they I think they artificially slowed down like Google.com search responses, and they found that like it's something ridiculous. Like every extra 100 milliseconds past the first 100, you drop like 5 to 10% of conversions, or so. like it's just it's truly crazy, right? And so like what like and just to sort of complete the thought, right? Your computer screen refreshes once every 60 seconds. That is 16 milliseconds. Like any program that executes faster than 16 milliseconds for user interaction is just vanity, right? You don't need to be faster than 16 milliseconds. And then anything that's like significantly slower than 100 milliseconds, people are going to begin to notice. Ruby format, like on very small Ruby files, will execute actually right at that 16 millisecond boundary. And like on the very largest files that exist, so like Shopify shop.rb, it will execute in less than 100 milliseconds. And so like we know that practically speaking, there are no Ruby files in existence today that you can't interactively wait for Ruby format to finish saving.
Cool. That's awesome. Neat. So the fact that Rubicop takes that like 6 times that length of time is a significant issue to using it in an interactive workflow.
Yeah, I mean, to give you some idea, right, of by comparison, Ruby format can auto format the entirety of the RSpec source space faster than Rubicop can format an empty file.
Incredible. Okay, cool. So making sure that it was as quick as possible in Ruby format was like a big part of the project, and I guess is what you spent a lot of time on. Which I want to follow. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, performance is like as important as just being able to do the formatting in a tool like this, actually. And so like we talk a lot about don't do premature optimization in software engineering, but like performance has been made a feature of Ruby format, and it has driven the engineering decisions.
Right. Sorry, Matt just said running RuboCop is a great excuse to grab a drink, which is the typical XKCD comic sword fighting on chairs moment.
Yeah, nobody wants their devs to be sword fighting on chairs when they could not be, right? So sure. I'm like to maybe say one thing before we get into this, right? Is it turns out doing this, by the way, is extremely difficult. So to give you some idea of timeline, right? The Go programming language was explicitly designed with tooling compatibility in mind, and it still took them a year of full-time paid engineering work to build Go format. Or sorry, they call it rubyfmt. I call mine root. Rubyfmt. Ruby has a nightmare arcane syntax. And actually, even more excitingly, is Ruby's Lexa. Ruby's grammar is complicated enough, and then the Lexa, which is the thing that comes before the grammar, is actually itself context sensitive on the parser state.
Interesting. Okay.
Which is to say, Ruby as a programming language is about as hard as possible to design a tool. If you were to rank programming languages by how hard it is to build a tool like this, Ruby format is probably up there. Ruby is probably up there. And so the Ruby format has been in development for 2.5, I guess nearly 3 years at this point. And it's very near, it's getting closer and closer to done every day, but I'm also not paid to work on this full time. And so this problem is just really hard. This is just a really hard problem to solve. Because the sort of the way you have to think about it is Ruby format can't change the behavior of your program when it rewrites source code.
Which is important. And to do that, unexpected behavior changes.
Yeah, to do that, you have to deal with the most complex programs imaginable, and so
Awesome. So, God, I really want to get into the yak bit, but I will resist for now, because I want to talk about that timeline. So you mentioned that obviously you're working on this as a maintainer, and I think there's something this kind of way you're going about it is really interesting to me, because I so rarely think I see open source projects that actually talk about the fact that they're not released and not ready. It often feels like whether they're out there, and I don't know, it's the way you speak about it is almost like the video game early access model. It's really interesting. But I want to talk about it in particular because in this 2009 talk that I referenced, you said you were hey, 6 months away from it being done, and now it's a little bit past that. So I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about, from as a maintainer doing this thing in your own time, trying to build this thing in your own time, the challenges of doing this, what would be hard R&D work if you were paid for this, and actually trying to make this thing happen, whilst it also being unpaid labor and lots of people watching it. It's a very public project. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, that's a good. People don't usually ask me this question, so I don't have a form response to that. Yeah. I think. What do I think about this? It's very rare that somebody asks me a question that is actually a stumper. So well done. I can't imagine having built Ruby format any other way, I guess, is perhaps so I think maybe the initiating context, and I checked, it's actually, the project is only about 2 years old. The initiating context, I think, is really helpful to understand here. So we were at RubyConf in Los Angeles, and Justin Searles and I were having this conversation about sort of these problems with RuboCop that I sort of outlined 10 minutes ago. And Justin was like, well, why don't we just build a RuboCop where we just freeze we pick all the good configuration options and just freeze them. And I was like, that solves one of the problems I have, but not both. And so I was like, Justin, I think that's a good idea for the short term. Mm-hmm. I want to go do this other much harder thing because I think the outcome will be better. And from there, I just sort of like started attacking this problem. I mean, like, frankly, I think a lot of so Joe, you know me well enough to know that like this is a core aspect of my personality. I can get like very care mad about computer problems, and like so really this is me like expressing my care mad in software. And so like for me like I think frankly the motivation is I want this tool to exist and be good, and the problem space is sufficiently hard that like if you look at the set of people in the world who could build this tool, it's like it's very small, right?
Sure.
Like you need to understand like internals of Ruby's implementation and how to read like Yak Bison files, and you need to understand like frankly the architecture of like modern language parsers and how to build performant software, and like frankly be able to understand like the massive complexities of the Ruby grammar.
For sure,
right?
yeah.
And
then on top of that, like actually be, using Ruby enough and be enough in that ecosystem to be confident that you're making the right decisions when it comes to like correct formatting, right? Like,
right, exactly. And so like this, and I think actually one of the things this brings up is an idea I have a lot about Ruby format, which is like most software engineers are taught to build today is very iterative, like very like making little steps at a time and getting feedback. And like Ruby format isn't like that. Ruby format is like it's like building a spaceship, right? You don't launch a cardboard spaceship and then like see it fail and then build a wooden spaceship. Like you can't do that, right? And similarly, you can't take someone who just like builds product code in Ruby and ask them to solve this problem. And I think one observation I have a lot of developer tooling, having worked on developer tooling in the form of RSpec, having worked on developer tooling at DigitalOcean, having worked on developer tooling at Google, is building developer tooling is much harder than most other kinds of engineering. And so like I frankly have this sort of like deeply held belief that if I don't do this, nobody else can, or at least the set of people who can, nobody else cares enough to do so.
Yeah, like the gap between people who care about this and are also like unhappy enough with just spending this time on like a Rubocop configuration is probably quite slim, right?
Right, exactly. Like I'm sort of willing to climb the cliff because nobody else will or can. And so the result, right, is like Ruby format is vaporware. Like you can't really use it yet, and it has like 500 stars on GitHub or something. Like the following is huge. And I think that's
700 stars on GitHub.
Great. And like I think that's warranted, right? Like because the technology that's already in there is amazing. Like we had to invent basically like entirely new software art in order to start building this thing. And I say we here because it's not just me. Sean Griffin of Active Record and Diesel fame, they have also contributed sort of like major patches. Nice. But like I mean the vast majority of it is me. And like
I was to see Corey Alexander. I think Corey's coming on the show at some point.
And like one of the things we've done is we have expressed a data structure in Rust which matches the Ruby parse tree. You know what did not exist before we like that is a thing that did not exist. We literally invented like because like data structures in Rust are a very formal specification, right? As far as I can tell, I have the best specification of what the Ruby grammar actually is of anybody on the planet because I
That's
expressed it in
fascinating.
Rust and
Yeah.
not C.
Right.
So yeah, it's like an interesting experiment.
Yeah,
in
so
these
this
sorts of
this brings
things.
me through a couple of things. So first of all, I want to talk about like how Ruby was passed before. Because I'll be honest, when I saw in your talk that it was done with Yak, I was very surprised because since I've done computer science and encountered like Yak and Bison, I don't think I've actually encountered like a mainstream programming language that used Yak and Bison. And so I
Oh
was
yeah.
very like surprised that that was the case for Ruby. I don't know why that was surprising to me. But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about like how I guess like the Ruby interpreter actually does the thing?
Sure,
Because I think
sure.
that was surprising to me.
Do we want to look at some code, or shall I just talk
Let's do
about
it.
it
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
a
No,
at
please
a high
do.
level?
Yeah,
So
if you're up for
fortunately,
showing it.
I have a checkout of Ruby on my computer. I'll go ahead and share my terminal,
Cool.
and we should be
I
able to see it.
think there we go. It's
Let me bump the
yeah,
font size so all of the friends at home can see it. Is that good?
perfect. That's perfect. I can see that great. If anyone in the chat is having issues, let us know. But it looks good on my screen.
So this is just a top level checkout of Ruby 261,
Cool.
which is like a recent-ish version of Ruby.
Right.
And at the top level, in here we have this file called parse.y. Parse.y is Ruby's parser. It's very large. Like the total length is something like it's 11,591 lines of code. And like the vast majority of it is rules like this. So like if you take a look at this, right, this describes a node in the parse tree called callargs,
Right.
and then all the possible variants that can take, right? So a callargs can be a command, or an args and a opt block arg, or a sox and an opt block arg, or
Right.
args and a comma, and then some sox, and then an opt block arg,
Yeah.
right? And like this is unreadable, right?
Right.
And like actually, and then like the things in the curly braces here, these are chunks of C code.
Okay.
And so the C code is basically saying like convert this to a value expression.
Right.
A value expression is the Ruby type that represents a like underlying C data structure for this expression.
Sure.
And then you turn that into a list. A list is a type of value, and then we can ignore this Ripper thing that's like super not important.
Okay.
So that's kind of like how the Ruby parser is structured. So it's these rules that are made up of other rules. Oh my god, my editor did not like that. And then like basically what happens is when Ruby boots, like Ruby will do a bunch of initialization stuff and then call the parser on the supplied input and get back a data structure. That data structure is then compiled into Ruby virtual machine instructions.
Right.
But like that's all very confusing, right? So like we can sort of like look actually at a more practical example of this. I have a bash alias set up to just run the Ruby parser because this is my life now.
I was about to say that's a terrifying insight into your life.
so like if we actually just run the Ruby parser of this code, right, we can actually see more cleanly what the data structure looks like, right?
Right.
So the top level node is called program, which just means this particular file. Method add arg tells us that we're going to do a method call and that it's going to have arguments. So we also have like a variant where this node is omitted and there are no arguments, right? And you can see that disappears. Fcall, and you can see here, right, we have ident. So an ident is any like sort of identifier in the program, so like a variable name or a function name. And then this is actually location information. So this tells us that this identifier occurs on line 1, character 0, the first character in the file, right? Ruby has optional parentheses, so we have arg_paren here to tell us we had parentheses. Args block is the list of args, and then you can see we have the integer 1, right?
Cool. Okay.
And so like the problem then comes sort of like in how do you like represent all possible variants of this in a data structure. So if we switch to Ruby format here, tree types. Oh look, there's a new version of the thing.
That was a nice little pop-up.
So we have in Rust. So maybe to get into it a little bit,
yeah.
Right. Ruby format. Most of the code in Ruby format is written in Rust.
Yeah.
We run the Ruby parser, and then we send the data structure that you just saw into a Rust program, and then we have an enum, which in Rust is basically just like a switch on all the possible types of data we can encounter. Yeah. And so an expression is kind of like the top level thing. It's like every statement in your program is an expression in Ruby. And so this enum represents literally every single thing that like a Ruby program can be.
How many lines is this enum?
That's a good question. So it's what is that? 157 to 80. Nice. So 77.
That's good 77 options.
Possible variants. And then you can see, right? Like each variant has subvariants.
Right.
And then we have code for dealing with these subvariants, and yeah, so this is actually like the basic and most important structure in Ruby format.
Fascinating. Okay, so you spoke a little bit in the talk about like why this had to be done in Rust instead of Ruby. I know there's like that's a many-headed hydra where there's lots of reasons, and a big part of it is speed.
Yeah.
But there was also like one of the other things you mentioned in there that was interesting. I'm trying to remember what that was. There was like a reason you started to talk with like there's a reason this can never be a gem, and that also had speed aspects. But there was another reason for that, and I can't quite put my finger on why that was. So
it's largely an argument from correctness actually. Right. So this is sort of like hard to explain without getting really really deep into it. But I guess I wonder if we can go back to the pure Ruby version.
I think this is our first Git graph on the show.
Do you want me to explain?
No, this is great. Go for it.
Jesus, so much code.
2 years of code, in fact.
Work in progress on rescues. Implement aref. Did I squash merge the like huge branch?
Was this the branch you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that was. I wonder. Let's see. This is like.
You squash merged. I mean, imagine you would squash merge a branch that had 5,000 commits in it. That makes sense. We'll get back to this branch in a bit. We're gonna circle around this whole thing into like some generalized advice about open source contributions, and this branch we're talking about is gonna come back.
Yeah, I'm trying to like. Oh yeah, this should be a good one to check out.
Okay.
This commit right here. Let's see. Oh my god. I wonder if this even builds. Does. Disable gems Ruby build. Good at typing. Oh hey, that is a working version of Ruby format in Ruby.
In Ruby, okay.
Yeah, I just rewound us back like 18
So you did originally start this in Ruby. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, this thing was originally written in Ruby. Yeah.
And how far into development did you realize that wasn't going to work?
Actually, to the point where there was basically a fully working auto formatter. So
fascinating.
If you look at this rev, we have this fixtures directory, which contains a bunch of Ruby files with the pattern like actual and expected.
Yeah.
So like 1300 lines of like actual Ruby examples covering most of the language's syntax. And so like these fixtures actually mostly persist in Ruby format today. And they cover like just all kinds of nightmarish edge cases in the language, right? So like for example, yes, this is my favorite nightmare example because this
Is this where we
this
get into Penelope's haunted house of Ruby code?
yeah. We can actually ignore what this does. The point is,
Right.
like, this is one of the most syntactically complicated
Cool.
Ruby files, and it does something quite reasonable. Actually, like, can I even remember how to run this old version of Ruby format? This is like fun times. We didn't have much of like a user interface back then, and like the current release has
Sure. Which is also, again, something we should touch on a bit later, that part of you want this to be like a Unixy command, so we should talk about the UI a little bit later.
Yes. I'm trying to see. This is funny. Like, does this script still work? So this is actually one of the really nice things about Git and automation, right? Is like, it still works. So like,
nice.
I have my entire history here well enough maintained that I was able to jump back to like this ancient release, and like my test script still works, right?
Right.
I'm deliberately trying to kill it here, and it's not playing ball. Let's see if that didn't do anything. That's fine. I will illustrate a point very shortly. I just need to get everything in the right state. Build, Ruby format, aspect core, lib, aspect core, what's going to sandbox, for example. Yeah, so like, did this actually do something reasonable? Okay, cool. Yeah, so like, this is the output of this like ancient Ruby-based version of Ruby format, and you can see it like this actually looks like very reasonable Ruby code, right?
Right.
If we try it with something like larger and more complicated, also like this is Ruby format bootstrapped on RSpec. I ran to what I knew to like build the test suite. And you can see it like starts to do. Let me make this window slightly wider. Slightly weird things like this. I'm actually trying to look at an example of something that I don't really agree with what it's doing. Yeah, so like this is a good example, right? You see this blank line between the if statement and this comment.
Yeah.
So like no Ruby developer would put a blank line here. This is like clearly wrong in some sense. And these warn blocks don't super look like they've been auto formatted either. I'm in fact like.
So what kind of thing would be happening to cause a random chunk of white space like that?
Yeah, so in this Ruby version, there's where's the code? This class called the render queue DFA, and it has a bunch of like ad hoc rules for inserting additional new lines in various places. And actually, so like you can see, right, there's like I don't know what it is, maybe like a half dozen of these rules here, because basically the tool inside Ruby format that walked the data structure in Ruby was not able to consistently identify where it should place blank new lines. If we go back to the Rust version and we look at the same object, you can see that we actually only have one such rule. And the reason for this is we were able to, because we have data types everywhere, more easily identify where we were in the correct state. And so more easily not have to fix up code at the end. And so this Ruby version, basically because it was hard to work out exactly where these new lines were coming from, I had to like have all of these rules to do fixing up in the final output, and those just disappeared when I moved to Rust.
That's awesome. Interesting.
Cool.
Okay. Wonderful. Rad. Okay. So we spoke about this a little bit, but I mentioned before the show that one of the things that we see on your Twitter quite often is various comments or misadventures with hellish Ruby syntax. So you've just shown us like a one particularly like gnarly example in one of the files there. Are there any like other parts that like have been, I guess, notable nightmares?
So I would say the overall theme is like Penelope makes an assumption about how Ruby works that like is perfectly reasonable, and then it doesn't work like that, right?
Sure.
So like let's let's do some live examples, right?
Awesome.
So like in Ruby, you can say begin rescue, and like put the rescued thing in a variable, right? So if I run this, like like you can see, right? It's captured the exception OMG, and then it's printing it to the screen, right? But it turns out this thing doesn't just have to be a local variable name. If you're inside, for example, a class, and you're in a class function, this can also be an instance variable. So if I say foo.new.bees, and then, let's do this, .bees, so reader. I should also say, like, this is not how I would actually code Ruby in real life. I'm just, like, trying
you wouldn't put bees everywhere?
No.
So that's actually, it's good you mentioned that. We've got a question after this from a student who's watching that kind of gets into that. So, sorry, continue here, and I'll jump in with that after.
And so you can see, right, like the exception has now been captured into the instance variable on this object, because I've said at E instead of E here, right? And then I added an at a reader, and then I'm pulling it out here on this line. Sure. So it turns out that what this position is this position is any valid assignment target anywhere in Ruby. So, for example, I can say, like, how should we do this? And this is basically just defining an attribute on the class instead of class objects.
Okay.
So if I say rescue to bacon.classObjectAtta, this is also completely valid. And so if I do this, this should work. Wait, why did that not work? Oh, it's because I only set it as a reader. So something like this will work eventually. And then I actually did a dev2 post about this, but like you can actually just go ahead and define this entire class like in here, and like this is a syntactically valid Ruby program,
right?
Like it will give you a warning.
Yeah.
This is a syntactically valid Ruby program. In fact, if I strip this out of being a method body, the warning will go away.
What? Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So where do you even begin to attack that in an auto formatter? Like, I guess this is more of a question of like, where does formatting start to blur into like warning you that your coding practice is wild? But like, how would you format that? Like, would you just leave it? Would that be like it's syntactically valid, so it's fine? Like, how opinionated is it?
So Ruby format issues the guarantee that if you are giving us a syntactically valid Ruby program, we will do something reasonable with it.
Cool. Okay.
Now in this case, like you haven't given us a reasonable program, but the actual output would look, I believe, and I'm not going to try and run it because I'm not a masochist, but the actual output would look, it's funny, I can sort of apply the rules in my head now.
Yeah.
So the output would look like this, right? So you can see here, and the way this works, Yeah, is the parentheses attached to the nearest parent. So in this case, like the closing parenthesis is indented relative to the rescue. So if we're inside a function, this whole thing would move in. Oh my God, can't Vim this early in the morning. So it would look like this if it was inside a function, for example, right? So the parentheses are parenting to the rescue, and then like each thing is just two indent levels. There's no like, so for example, right, you could totally reasonably put all the code so that like the things were lined up,
Sure.
which would be here, I think. Yeah, you get the idea.
Right.
And so Ruby format doesn't do that. It prefers to line things up like this. And so we will do something reasonable with your unreasonable case. It's just not clear to me what reasonable is, and I think this is.
Which totally makes sense. Okay, so that question I wanted to. Oh, sorry, we've got another comment from Kushtos, who, by the way, this person commenting writes a programming language for a living. Having flashbacks to my Rails days, there was always just one person on the team that would just learn something like this and decide it must be part of their next PR. Open source maintenance. But yeah, so we had a question from a student who asked. Why would people use Ruby? Like, what are the perks of using Ruby? So this is a bit of a tangent, but while you've got your editor open, I figured you'd be able to very quickly show us some reasons you like Ruby.
Yeah, I mean, do I have a Rails app around? You know what? What's the simplest answer to this question? The reason I like working in Ruby is it allows me as a developer to be extremely productive. I have never found another programming language where I am able to write like good enough code as fast. And in particular, this applies in the Ruby on Rails context. Ruby on Rails is a framework that is sort of single-mindedly designed around the idea that if you want to go to from zero to a functional web application, you should be able to do that as quickly as possible. And like Rails comes with a bunch of tooling to help developers do that more and more quickly. And if you sort of listen to David, DHH, it's funny. David is something of a friend, so I call him David, but he's DHH.
I've never ever heard him not called DHH. This is the first.
He sort of talks a lot about like the idea that Rails should sort of conceptually compress as much as possible so that you, the developer, are allowed to focus on writing what's important to your application. So like, for example, Rails includes a tool to make it very easy to lay out your database. It includes a tool to generate front-end code for you. It includes a whole Webpacker compilation pipeline. It includes, like, it deals with a bunch of security stuff just for you. There's a huge ecosystem around this, right? And I mean, like, as if to sort of demonstrate that Rails as a framework has served the test of time, like some of the biggest companies in the world are using it, like GitHub and Shopify. Stripe, where I work, is not built on Rails, but is built on Ruby. And, you know, Stripe processes payments for lots and lots of startups that are all very popular, right? And Ruby is serving us just fine, right? To the point where, like, Stripe continues to invest in Ruby. And so for me, why I like working in Ruby is, frankly, there is no other programming language I've ever worked in where the combination of tooling, ecosystem, and the language itself is so clearly optimized for developer velocity.
Awesome.
Would you mind if we took a quick break for about 2 or 3 minutes? And I will be right
back. I need to top up water as well. So we will take a quick break, folks. We'll be back very shortly. See you on the other side. That was the jankiest return to the screen ever. Hello, we're back.
Hi.
Oh, wonderful. I've got more water. I am ready and refreshed. So yeah, thank you for taking that detour through our Ask Us question. I hope that answered your question, Skywolf. Penelope Ghosty New also says hi in chat.
Hi, that's my girlfriend.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome to the
Yeah.
stream. Cool. Where to now? So, I guess we spoke about like the length of like time that this has taken to develop and like kind of the development approach to that. So where is Ruby format at now? Like how close to it being where you would consider like it released is it?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So this is Trunk. So actually we renamed off of master before GitHub decided what they were going to do about it.
Cool.
So we have Trunk. And you can see, right, if we look at the Git graph,
Right.
like we actually had a release of the v0.4.0 tag like pretty recently. And so where Ruby format is today is like I'll just run this it's a fully complete Rust program. It builds. Ruby format embeds. We have a broken.
It builds until you're on live stream.
Ahead of Trunk by one commit. That's worrying. Should we fix? Do you want to fix this live?
Oh, absolutely. That's gonna be great.
Let's take a look at what's wrong here. I'm so glad I didn't put a broken commit.
One of our viewers was saying they were skipping class to be here. I feel like I'm at class right now.
And now it does build. Oh, it's not gonna lint. Make lint. What does our linter say? And like, so actually, this is worth talking about. Like, Ruby format is built to a very high standard. It has a big test suite and Rust linting turned on, and an additional Rust linter called Clippy, and a tool called Rust format running that is like the Rust equivalent of Ruby format, I guess.
Right.
So anyway, Ruby format embeds a Ruby interpreter, and basically what that allows us to do is like run the Ruby parser. So it is a Rust program. The Ruby interpreter is a C program, and it turns out Rust and C work together really nicely. And so we can just take Ruby and shove it inside our Rust program. When Ruby format boots, we execute Ruby's parser. Actually, and I can show you this, librubyformat.rb, by running Ruby. So you'll notice, right, this is a Ruby source file. This this is a Ruby class. Its subclass is Ripper sex builder PP. So this is like Ruby's built-in parser class. We then add a bunch of additional state because we have to track many additional things on top of what Ripper tracks in its execution. Sure. To be able to properly spit code back out the other side. Basically, it turns out that Ruby's parser is insufficiently detailed to build source code from by default, but it does expose enough hooks to let us hook in everything we need. And the reason it's insufficient, I can see the look on your face there.
I don't understand how that works as a parser then.
Well, but think about it, right? So the parser is actually a level of abstraction higher than source code. And you don't need all of the information that was in the source code to compile a Ruby program. So for example, a thing that's in the source code that you don't care about at virtual machine instruction time is the statement 1 line down, 2 lines down, 1,000 lines down, 5,000. Like you just don't care, right?
Yeah.
Because the white space is meaningless to the program. And so we have to, for example, track locations on a bunch of extra symbols that Ruby doesn't track for us. And actually, this is what this loop does right here. It defines a bunch of so the way Ripper is structured is it has these like on whatever methods, and so we hook these on event methods to add the line number and column number so that we track that information,
Cool.
right? And then in Ruby format, where does this code live? It's funny, like I don't usually give source code tours on the fly.
Well, it's great. Thank you for doing it.
Lib Ruby format source Ruby ops. Yeah, so we actually we have this function here which loads that source file, and include stir exclamation mark here is actually a Rust macro. And what this Rust macro does is it takes the entirety of this file and it embeds it in the Rust program as a string. So by saying let rubyfmt program equals include stir bang and then the path, this is now embedded in our program as a string. Eval stir, as you might expect, just evaluates a string of Ruby source code. And so this is how we actually like load that code in. And then further down, you can see here we actually have these calls. rbconst get at parse, and then rbobject parser gives us a reference to that class in Rust. And then rbfuncall is the function that lets us call a Ruby function from C, or Rust in this case. So we call new to make an instance of that class, and then we return a pointer to this object, and then we have a parse function, which eventually ends up calling this real run parser method, which nice. Well, and so the reason we have real run is if you are calling Ruby from Rust, Ruby code can raise exceptions. Rust doesn't understand the concept of a Ruby exception, and so we have this method called rbprotect. What rbprotect does is it lets you pass a C function pointer and a mutable state, and you can see we passed the state here, right? And then if the state comes back as 0, we know we succeeded, and if it comes back as anything else, we know we failed and we have a Ruby exception to deal with. Okay. So that's like how the embedding works. And then I was gonna, you know what? Let's just check out the last working version.
I think I can get the Rails bit in chat for someone.
And so, like, just to sort of narrate the build here, like, we compile Rust, and then we run a bunch of tests. So we have the fixtures I was showing you earlier, and we basically assert that for every fixture, the formatting is always exactly the same. So this is basically our test suite that says, is formatting, like, good enough, right? And, like, the problem with these fixtures is they're all very small files. They're typically, like, 1 to 7 lines of code. And this is basically like our unit tests. It says, do we do something reasonable in all of these like hard edge cases we've identified? We then also have functionality tests. So like, for example, you can see here, we are comparing the MD5 of the output of 2 Ruby programs, one before formatting and one after formatting. And this is to do things like check, are we reformatting strings correctly? Because actually, Ruby format normalizes all strings have double quotes. And so, like, in Ruby, there are about 5 different ways to create a string. It turns out that if you rewrite those, sometimes you introduce really interesting edge cases. And I actually didn't write the most recent version of that logic. Somebody actually, a third party, contributed a patch because they identified a ton of bugs. So this is the core formatting loop now, where it's actually formatting every file in RSpec. So once we formatted every file in RSpec, we're going to run RSpec's test suite, and that basically tells us, did we break RSpec, right? And we can, and given how complicated, and you can see the test suite running now, and like given how complicated RSpec is as a program, if it works, if you don't break RSpec's test suite, you're basically golden. And so this is like the core of what Ruby format does
Nice, yeah.
for its own testing.
Yeah.
And so like, oh, I'm getting a phone call. Never mind.
If you need to take time, that's totally good.
Nope. No. This is fine. So like that's sort of like the core
Cool.
testing loop. And so the question to like, is it ready yet? Is like, no, because if we sort of look at the diff here, I wonder if we can spot something that like, so yeah, this is obviously wrong, right? If you look, Ruby format has unindented this comment
I see.
one level,
Okay. Yeah.
and so that's like clearly wrong.
Right.
There's an additional space here, which is maybe questionable. And like as we just sort of scroll this,
Right.
that private move is actually correct. Oh, and here's a fun one. So Ruby format is like very opinionated about how things separated by commas
Okay.
should be formatted. And so like you can see here, right? Like it's taken this like notify bisect complete comma, and then these were all aligned. It's actually
Yeah.
reformatted this so they're
So they're all
all like
aligned.
yeah, and that's just like how it works with that.
Right.
Um, and looking for other interesting. This one is really interesting to me. Like, I don't actually super understand what's going on here. So, like, this is actually, I might consider this to be a bug. Is
Hmm.
like, you can see right, there's this raise bisect failed error,
Yeah.
and then this thing where you do slashes at the end
Right.
of a string in Ruby is actually it's actually a first class construct in the grammar. Many people
Hmm.
think this is escaping the new line. This is
Hmm.
actually not escaping the new line. This is a first class construct in the grammar called a string concat.
Okay.
And you can see here the first one is like at one level, and then the next
Yeah.
strings are like one
They
level
indent it
in.
one. Yeah.
I know that is a deliberate decision I made, but just like looking at this, I'm not convinced this is right.
Interesting.
And so where we're sort of at today in the specifics
Yeah.
is Ruby format won't break your program,
Hmm.
but it might do weird things with the formatting.
Yeah.
Although
Which is a
actually, like,
pretty good place to be honest.
and like actually, so like here's an example of
Yeah.
something that's obviously broken. Like,
Right.
why is there a
Why
big
is it
old
brought it
wall?
onto that line? Yeah.
Yeah, no. Like the lining here is fine.
Okay.
I'm more confused about why there's a big old wall of spaces.
I
Like,
see. Right.
why are there 8 spaces between this expression and the closing
Yeah.
parenthesis? This is clearly a bug.
Interesting.
And so like yeah, I mean, but actually, if you look at most of the out, also deleted this comment. This is a semantically important comment that got
Right.
deleted, so that's fun. Um,
Yeah, I'm guessing it should
yeah,
like you're never looking to delete comments semantically important or not, right?
yeah. So it's like, but like most of the code here looks very reasonable, right?
Yeah.
And so like it's really at the point now where most of the formatting works really well. There are like it's really there are edge cases,
Mm.
and there are still some breakages. We know there exist Ruby files today that Ruby format will crash on.
Hmm.
They are edge casey, but they still exist, and we want to get to
Right.
the point where there are no Ruby files that we are aware of
Right.
that we
Cool.
crash
Awesome.
on. Yeah.
Rad. Cool. Thank you for showing us this live. That was super cool. So
Mm-hmm.
the other question I've had saved up for a million years. We spoke a little bit about the UI of this as like a command line application and like how you want this to work versus like the things already in the ecosystem, and use the term Unixy in your talk. So like,
Yeah.
how are you trying to make this thing like work and be used?
So wait, where are we? Oh, right, we're in the wrong directory. Um, um, if we look at how Ruby format works, right? So Ruby format compiles out to this binary on my
Mm-hmm.
command line, right? If we look at how it works, it has a couple of sort of like really key behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
One is that it can take input from standard in.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and you can see here that's not a very interesting auto format, but like
Yeah.
you can see here, right, it's running and then it will output standard out,
Right.
which is just like a very common Unixy behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it will also do something similar if like it's passed a Ruby file as a file name. It will also output to standard out. And like the reason for this is that we sort of like consider like fundamentally what the Unix philosophy is that text, like tools should be small and focused, and that text is a universal interface. I would argue that like Ruby format is an incredibly small and focused, like for the amount of code that's in it, it only does one thing.
Yeah.
It does exactly one thing, and that is consume Ruby files and auto format them.
Right.
It just happens to be the case that like that is a phenomenally hard computer science problem. And then the other part of that is text is a universal interface, right? So like a really good example of this is like let's imagine this is this is the simplest possible Ruby file. So pb copy, right, is this now not going to work? That would be amazing. pb copy is the OS 10 command line tool to like put something in the copy paste buffer, right? So you can see here I paste and like it prints those lines out. So I can now, for example, say like pb copy pipe Ruby format pipe, pb paste pipe Ruby format pipe pb copy, and that will work, right? And so like what it means to be Unixy, in my opinion, is inputs from standard in, outputs to standard out, so that it can be composed with other Unix tools. But that's not the only way we work, right? So we also have, if I do a hard reset here on my RSpec repo, and you can see here there's no diff. I also have, do I have rubyfmt? I apparently do have it on my path. If I do rubyfmt -i lib, this is the debug version. So the debug version, it does lots of output. But if we just kill it there, right, and now look at the diff, you can see there's diff, right? And that's what the I flag tells it. You know what? Format these files in place instead of going to standard out, right? And so we have those flags to do like those editor-ish, like more editor. Oh my god, that screwed up my terminal. It's fine. This happens all the time. And like that's how it works, right? And so if you actually look at the Vim extension for Ruby format, it passes the I flag to Ruby format.
I see.
To get that in place formatting, because like if you're in Vim, you don't want the output to go to standard out. You want it to overwrite the file so that when you reload the file, it's there, right?
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Rad. So unless there's any questions in chat, I think would be a good time to go by that little detour that we discussed earlier about kind of like, I guess, like the open source maintenance aspect of that. And particularly I want to go through like an experience that you shared where you had like fun comments on the internet because you were working in a branch, which was like how people were expecting it. Let me drop your screen share back out. So do you want to explain like what happened? And I think the reason I'll explain the reason I want to go by this after you, I guess, kind of explain the situation.
Yeah, let me see if I can actually find.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I can actually add that
branch. Well, it'll be a different screen share. Give me a second.
No worries. I'm getting overly keen with my screen share button.
SPR. Let me see if I can actually even find this. Yeah. Now, there's a fun question of whether I even want to show this. I don't want to show this because this pull request is covered in my dead name.
Right. Yeah, totally.
So, but the basic situation is when we started rewriting Ruby format in Rust, like I wanted to do that on a branch, like a long-running branch, because I didn't want to have the main branch in a sort of broken state, right? Because like we had a functional Ruby-based Ruby, well, we knew it wasn't going to be the end product, but like there was good working code on that branch, right? And so I opened like this branch called Oxidize, and that was I opened that branch on the 14th of July, 2019, and I merged it on the 27th of February of this year. So that is like 9-ish months? No, it's like less. It's like no, it's like 10ish
time. It's still March. It's 1 month. We're still in March. We never left March.
It's 10ish months of, so that's 10ish months of development, right?
Yeah.
In that time, I was talking about Ruby format, and like I was getting comments on Twitter where people were like, "Repo seems dead. She's not working on it anymore." And I was like, "No, it's like because the master branch hadn't been committed to for like 10 months at that point, right?"
Right.
And so it's like, well, like, yeah, because like, and frankly, like, okay, not to get political on your show, but like, men on the internet need to like listen more and talk less.
As a man on the internet, I'm strongly in agreement.
And I was like, no, and so I think like there's a sort of issue, right, where like people go to GitHub, they don't spend very much time looking at the thing, be it like the main landing page of your repo or like the green dots. And like just immediately assume like nothing's happening, when in fact like I was on this like really hard coding tear to like get this thing going. I mean, like, and to give you some example, some idea of this, right? Like, actually, like, what's the diff stat on this branch? So the diff stat on this branch is plus 6,000, negative 2,000, right? Like a lot of code.
That's a chunky, yeah.
Like because it's basically a complete, and it's 142 commits. Like, and it's a complete implementation, basically a complete implementation of a Ruby program in Rust, right? Plus like a huge refactor, like it's basically a complete rewrite. And so like what do you do? Like, how at that point are you like, no, go look over it? But like the thing is, that was a very small minority. The people who really cared about this program, which is a lot of people. Like, and I think this is like, to zoom out a bit, right? Like, the thing that keeps me going on Ruby format is that so many people, as we mentioned, 700 stars, like, are excited. Like, at some point in the future, this will be ready for people to daily drive. And when it is, that will be a very exciting day because, I can sleep. and B, like,
well, you think you can sleep. That's when like the gates are open as like full maintainer. Everyone's going to be on this like opening new issues situation.
Yeah, and actually, I I have considered that, and like there's going to be this intermediate state actually where and I can sort of like vaguely talk about this, but like we're gonna actually do a small trial of this at Stripe. We have actually one of the Stripe has a really amazing developer tooling team, and we have done some work to integrate Ruby format behind a feature flag into Stripe's core developer tooling. And so we can actually trial it on like small numbers of Stripes before we roll it out to like the general public.
I like it.
Yeah, you know, you have sharks, you have Googlers, you have Stripes, and use that to sort of like battle test it a little bit more. Like, the Big Bang release is a horrible idea. Like, I'm really good at writing software, and like I can get it right for my use cases, but like all it takes is one customer to destroy your assumptions about how your software works. Like, no one will give you more and better feedback than the first other person that ever sees your tool, right?
For sure.
So yeah, I'm gonna try it out on some folks I have like highly privileged access to before I release it into the wild.
Again, like talking about how you're building this thing being like different and interesting to me, that's also very different and interests me from what I see from other open source projects. Like it's fascinating because like this is being built and released so much like so many products, but like is not a way we see in open source. It's super cool.
So I mean I do genuinely think of it as I am just I'm effectively building a stealth mode product in the open.
Right. Yeah.
Like because you can't like I can give you a really good example of this. I frequently get asked, how can I random Ruby developer, contribute to Ruby format? And my answer is like, I'm sorry, you can't. Like this, like I wish I had work for you to do. But like, like this is kind of like me like in my mad genius zone doing,
Right.
my own inventing, right?
Yeah.
There are tweaks and there are like, for example, the editor plugins are mostly
Yeah.
contributed by other people.
Right.
But like the core of it, nobody but me is ever going to be able to work on it. Well,
Yeah.
like apart from maybe Sean Griffin, but like
Right.
2 people, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's not like most open like it doesn't
Right.
super feel like working on it. You know what it
Yeah.
actually feels like a lot to me is research. Like
Interesting.
working on Ruby format feels super
Yeah.
like doing research because like
Yeah.
you're sort of on your own, you're thinking about a hard problem.
Right.
You like progress is very fits and like
And
there's
you're
a
still
thing I'm
releasing the
working.
results, and it's all going out. Sorry. Go on.
Yeah, and I'm doing it very like there have been basically like anytime I make like a sort of like major change to how it works,
Yeah.
a new revision goes out. So like
Right.
revision 0.3 was the
Mhm.
one where it dealt with comments a lot better. Like before then, the Rust version would just randomly delete your comments all the time. Now it randomly deletes your comments only some of the time.
Right.
And so yeah, like as we're sort of wrapping up here, like I think you're sort of right. This is not like traditional
Mhm.
open source. It's a lot more like working on
Yeah.
research.
Right. So the reason I wanted to go through this, and I think we went from my original point into one that was like so on track with this, is that there's been a lot of kind of talk this Hacktoberfest about like making sure your contribution is welcome, and there's been like some discourse on Twitter about like, oh, it's not open source if you don't accept everyone's random contribution, right? And so I think this is super interesting from two perspectives. Like your story of like the branch and what happened with that is like a really great example of like, hey, actually make sure you understand like the project and how the people on that project work before you wade into this. And then secondly, like open source is done in many ways and shapes and forms, and there's many different ways to contribute, and like it's not always necessarily the big open ball pit of just everyone throw everything in, and that's also like again something you need to understand as you're looking at projects this Hacktoberfest, to what extent your contributions are welcome and to what extent the maintainer is able to accept things based on like the difficulty of what they're working on. So yeah, I think that was super useful.
Yeah.
Cool.
Is there anything else you'd like to?
I think I've exhausted all my questions, and we are running close to time. So, Hugh Rawlinson is it's not open source if you don't accept every PR. It's quite a take. Yes, he agreed.
Love you here.
He's been hanging out for a while.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for having me. I've had a
Thank you for
blast,
being here.
and like
Yeah.
it's always fun to talk about my like favorite bugbear, which is crazy
Yeah.
Ruby shit. So
I'm so glad we got to do that. And thank you for giving us the live code tour. So yeah, I will drop you backstage now. Thank you again for being on the show. I'll do
Of
my
course, thanks so
outro
much.
and have a wonderful day. Wonderful. So thank you again so much, Penelope. That was awesome. I'm super excited to look back at the recording and get my head around some of the stuff I saw that at the time. I was like, thank you all for being here and for participating in the chat. Thank you, Skywall, for being so active. I hope you those resources are useful to you and you learned something today. And I'm going to check out your programming language after this. That sounds super fun. So what do we have coming up on the help desk next? This evening we have one more show. That is at 4 p.m. EDT, 10 p.m. Central Eastern European time, Central European time, my time. That show is with Andrew Seward. We're going to be chatting about developer communities and being a good member of developer community. So a perfect next episode following this kind of end conversation with Penelope there, I think. Andrew runs Tech Nottingham, one of my favourite developer communities. I'm only a little bit biased given that I studied in Nottingham. But they do some really interesting things. And they have some projects that kind of power that community in interesting ways. So we're going to be chatting to Andrew as well. For the rest of the schedule for the week, that schedule is up at twitch.tv RaiseDev's schedule. That's updated weekly, so you can see our schedule for the week there now. Let me give you a little taste of what is to come later on in the week. So tomorrow we have Flacky in the morning slot. Flacky is well known in the Mozilla community. We're going to be doing something kind of wild with Flacky. He's going to bring an old Firefox OS app, and we're going to get into it and look at the code and kind of like talk about the evolution of vanilla JavaScript and HTML and like where Firefox OS was going and where we're at with web technologies now. I'm really excited about that. We're also going to be hearing Flacky's perspective as a freelancer in kind of like the developer community world and how that works as a career and how that can help you too. We're going to be talking to Cybrand, who is a developer advocate at Microsoft on C++. We're going to be hearing about what size day is like as a developer advocate, and how that is for C++ as well, which strikes me as a difficult thing. It's a very C-heavy day tomorrow, because in the evening we've got Shana Matthews coming on, and again that's kind of a tour of some old code. We're going to be getting into some old C code that Shana wrote in university and talking about how she might write that better today. So, super exciting day tomorrow. We do also have a packed schedule on Friday that you can see up on our schedule site, so you can check that all out at the link below. So, final thing, if you have a question or Hacktoberfest problem that you're trying to solve this month, you can get help from the show. When we have questions, we find a guest that can answer them, and we answer them here live on the show, and we send you the answer direct to your inbox in a nice little recording. You can ask those questions to raise.dev/Hacktoberfest. If you want more of a video guide on how to submit questions, you can go to our Twitch page, to the video highlights, where you can find me walking through filling out that form. And then the last thing, if you are an early stage developer, or you're a developer looking to level up their career in another way, say getting a promotion or moving on to your next job, Raise.dev is a service to help you get the experience you need. We are free, matching you with experienced coaches to help you kind of make it to where you want to be in your career. Hugh just got himself banned. Sorry, Hugh. If you want to find out more about Raise.dev, you can jump to Raise.dev and you can sign up for a kickoff call with our coaches right now. We're onboarding new coaches all the time because demand has been great. Thank you so much. And some of the new coaches I'm really excited about. One of them has the most beautiful video setup I've ever seen, so I'm hoping he gives me some tips sometime this week. So if you're interested in the Raise.dev, you can check out the link below, or if you go to our Twitch highlights, you'll find a video called Bridging the Developer Experience Gap with our founder John Britton, where me and him chat about where Raise.dev came from and where he wants it to go and how it's all going to work. So you can find that on our Twitch page as well. So that is everything from me. I will see you if you join us tonight in 4.5 hours. If you don't join us tonight, I hope to see you tomorrow or sometime else on the show. Give us a follow. If you follow us on Twitch, you'll get notifications when we go live. Once you click the heart to follow, then click the little bell. They separate it. Once you click the little bell, you'll get notifications, so you'll know whenever we go live. You can also follow us at RaiseDevs on Twitter, where we put out all of our announcements as well. So see you on the next one. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you again to Penelope for being on the show. Bye.